Hello, welcome to the Texas Legislative Update. I'm your host, David Blackmon, here with Jason Modglin, the president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. Jason, how you doing today?
David, it's good to be with you.
Hey, man, it's been a busy week in Austin, I imagine, and not just with the session, but with some pretty nasty weather down there in that part of the state. What didn't y'all get hit fairly hard this week?
We were thankfully a little further south than
Okay, it stayed
Waco,
north.
but Waco really got hit very hard and very big size hail
Oh
and
man,
yeah, pretty nasty
did
stuff.
you see that video of the baseball size hail going into the pool and the Hereford steer walking along behind the pool in the
Yeah,
middle of that hailstorm? That was wild. Um, well, anyway, enough about that. Look, this is the week ended. We're recording on April 28th. We've got 33 days left in the regular session, and there is an awful lot of business that needs to get done in those 33 days. Um, and so I guess, before we started recording, you were talking about they're working today on Friday and planning to maybe even work into the weekend next week, huh?
that's right. Yeah, so first full day calendar today. They've been doing a couple small items the past few Fridays, local bills and things of that nature. But this is really the first full Friday with a very long calendar. They'll get out later this afternoon, and then it's anticipated next weekend they'll work through Saturday, maybe even into Sunday, but probably not. And then deadline pretty quick approaching. May
Yeah.
10th is the deadline for House bills to get past their second reading, which is a kind of a gate that bills have to get through. They've got to be read 3 times in each chamber. And so second reading's a key checkpoint, if you will, for those bills to get passed. And so
And
that's
that's
part of
for
the House
bills that
rules
originate in the House, right?
for bills that originate in the
Yeah.
House. Yes, good,
Yeah.
very good clarification there. And so that's quickly approaching, and the sounds of wailing and gnashing of teeth are House bills that are quickly seeing that date approaching.
Well, and that's pretty common for a session of the Texas legislature. So, it all, every time, every session, it all gets kind of frantic around this point. But then, people who've been involved in numerous sessions beforehand realize that this is just kind of the way the process is set up. And so, I mean,
Absolutely.
it helps to create, in some respects, it helps to create that kind of anxiety to kind of force things, the process to work. So just the way things go, man. And I guess the big news this week, or at least some of the big news, was how this new sense of growing urgency is creating quite a lot of conflict. I think public kind of rhetorical matches between the speaker and the Lieutenant Governor Patrick with all these issues up in the air now.
That's
That
right.
again, that's not really unusual either, is it?
No, it's not unusual. There is a bit of a delay, a bottleneck, if you will, in one of the legislative agencies that supports both the House and Senate. It's called the Texas Legislative Council,
Yeah.
and essentially they're nonpartisan attorneys that help draft legislation. And their role has really been expanded over the last several sessions to take on more of the duties that staff typically did a decade ago. Write bill analysis, write background and purpose, write some of the explanations for what the bill does. They did this for a variety of reasons, wanting kind of an attorney to look at it so that it would meet some of the rules requirements. But that tends to delay things. Legislative Council has a bit of a review process, and so rather than outsourcing this work to a young 21, 22-year-old on your staff to write this, now it goes through a couple different layers. And so Lieutenant Governor Patrick pointed out in a tweet, which is how we're getting a lot of our news these days, that the House had over 1,000 bills that have been successfully voted out of their House committee, but have still yet to be filed in the calendars committee. And while the chairman certainly can exercise some prerogative and hold that committee report a little bit, that's probably not the case for over 1,000 bills. More likely, staff have requested certain things of legislative counsel, and they're simply not back yet. That bill analysis is not back yet, or their committee substitute is not back yet, and so that's creating a real bottleneck. And then there also seems to be some differences, if you will, between the House parliamentarian and the legislative council, and that's resulted in a number of points of order being called on the House floor that have slowed down the process a little bit as well. These differences in interpretation come up every couple of sessions, and so it's only adding to some of the difficulty in moving House bills out of the way and taking up Senate bills. And so I think the lieutenant governor voiced some frustration on that this week, and
He
probably
did.
some senators have voiced that to him. So,
Yeah.
yep.
Well, and in voicing that frustration, he said a comment that got a lot of attention. He said, he doesn't have the authority to call a special session to deal with some of these issues. Only the governor has the authority to call the special session. But he did point out, and it's a parliamentary procedure he's used in the past, that he could force the governor to have to call a special session. Talk about how that would work.
Yeah, so I think most recently it's been as a result of sunset bills. I think we've talked about sunset on Public Utility Commission and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, that every so often those agencies have to be reauthorized. And so a couple sessions ago, there were some key agencies that needed to be reauthorized. They were not included in what's called a safety net bill. And so the Senate opted to not take up those bills, and essentially allow them to die at the end of the legislative session. And that forced the governor to call a special session specifically for those items. You're absolutely right that both presiding officers, either the speaker or the lieutenant governor, can't dictate what a special session takes up. But there's a couple duties that the legislature has. They have to pass a budget. They're the only body that can authorize funds out to be taken from the Treasury. The governor or even what's called the Legislative Budget Board can't authorize that expenditure into the next biennium. So that has to occur prior to September 1. And then these sunset bills, those agencies will start to wind down starting September 1, unless they are reauthorized. So the threat is not direct. I can't direct you to put this on the special session call. Only the governor can call a special session. But by holding some of those items back, you potentially force a special session. And it's a bit of high stakes chicken. May remember that game. And so I want you to act on this item. I'm going to hold the budget, or I'm going to hold a sunset bill in hopes that we do have a special session, and you add that to the call. And so, hopefully, I think everyone is hopeful, particularly right now, that they'll get some time away from the building and away from Austin, be back with their families. And so that's certainly weighing on the desire to be petty right now is hopefully eroding quickly as people are looking out the window and deciding they want to be outside rather than at
Yeah.
the Capitol.
Well, hopefully, it gets hot in Austin in July and August. So yeah, you don't
It's
want to be
very
back
hot.
there. You don't have to be. One of Lieutenant Governor's big issues, of course, and Governor Abbott said it was a big issue for him too in his inaugural speech, was fixing the grid and dealing with the remaining illnesses the grid suffers from, for lack of a better way to put it. Two bills that passed through the Senate that were part of Lieutenant Governor's emergency agenda were Senate Bill 6, Senate Bill 7, that are designed to deal with shortage of thermal capacity on the grid, dispatchable thermal capacity, and some other reforms to how the market works to make it send the right market signals to build this capacity. And that they were passed April 5th out of the Senate, sent to the House. Took 2 weeks to get them referred to the State Affairs Committee. And I think one of the Lieutenant Governor's frustrations is that there they languish without a scheduled hearing and no real indication that they'll get a hearing. And I just wonder what you might be hearing around the Capitol.
Yeah, so what they did take up this past week was the PCM guardrails
Right.
bill. That seems like that's kind of the item of the package of bills to strengthen the grid. The item that's really got kind of the most support out of that committee in the House. There's certainly some very important things on Senate Bill 7 that would help strengthen the grid, but either the state-owned assets or the state-supported assets, the criticism of that has really, I think, found a home in the House, and so hopefully, there's continued dialogue on areas to improve. The House, I think, has done a little bit more on the transmission side of things. Just yesterday, they passed a grid resiliency bill. Part of the challenges that we have with the poles and wires are that they blow over and they fall
Yeah,
down.
they do.
And so the extent to which the legislature can express support for investing in more resilient lines, that might save us when we have wind events, and that might be able to help us a little more on other types of events, whether it's cold or whether it's flooding down the road. Hopefully those folks will get together and really move forward with the package. I think the legislature has to act to put in some guardrails on the PCM, and so both sides have to kind of work together on that front, and I think that there's support on both sides for that. It's in what else do you potentially add on to that or complement that to make sure that we're continuing to attract investment to the state. You've had a number of generators express that they will only build if the PCM goes into effect, and so that's I think a couple months ago when those announcements were coming out, it was nice. Okay, here's the investment that potentially is coming to the state when the PCM is announced. Now it's being taken more as a threat. If PCM doesn't go into effect, we're going to pull out. We're not going to invest in this type of investment in new generation. And so that's
to be clear, that threat is coming from generators
yes,
who have for more than a decade now really pretty much failed to build thermal capacity, period. Right.
There's been some replacement,
how
but that's
much
about it.
of a threat is that really? I mean, it's a threat to just go on about doing
more of the
business.
same. Right.
Yeah, more of the same. So I got to tell you, man, I get very frustrated hearing that argument from power generators in this state. And the PCM's fine. It's been adopted by the PUC. It was recommended by ERCOT. I know that. I understand that. But I don't think anybody in Austin believes that PCM is going to result in the building of adequate new capacity to deal with the problem that remains on the grid.
Right.
And it's just really, really frustrating to me that members of the State Affairs Committee, I'm just going to be blunt about it, are going to accept that argument and do nothing again, nothing real to resolve an issue that everybody acknowledges is a problem for the grid, and try to pass it off on this thing that's not going to get the job done. So anyway, that's my rant for the day, and I'll leave it there.
No,
anyway,
understandable,
and that's not necessarily endorsed by Jason Modglin.
That's right. Oh, thank you.
So, it's my view and my view.
Good caveat there, and thank you for that. No, I hear you, and you hope that at the end of session we'll be able to point to some concrete things that are improving the grid, and not, as I've heard a number of times this session, that the structure continues to incentivize large customers to get out of the grid, to come up with their own solutions. And while that might seem nice, and certainly the environmental community endorses those types of measures, remove yourself from the grid, create batteries or solar, or just go extreme on your conservation efforts. That doesn't benefit the 30 million Texans that want to make sure we have warm homes and can go to our place of business and things of that nature, that really aren't invested in the day-to-day generation of electricity. And so to hear very good, prominent industrial customers in our state say, we'll go it alone, that doesn't benefit the overall state. And so I hear you 100%.
That was a much more constructive way to put it, Jason. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So let's move on. Let's move on to carbon capture and utilization and storage. We've talked several times about several bills that have been introduced that would clarify the pore space ownership and resolve some other issues to kind of make Texas a more attractive environment to invest in those kinds of CCUS projects. But I guess we didn't have any real movement on any of that legislation past week, correct?
Yeah, not in the Senate. I think again can kind of be categorized in two different fashions. Senate had an omnibus bill that was filed in Senate Natural Resources, and it had a rough hearing. There were a number of landowner groups, from the Forestry Association on down to the cattle raisers and Farm Bureau and land and mineral owners, that really had some very strong objections to the legislation moving forward. There was not if you'll tweak this and maybe reorganize this section, we can get on board. I mean, it was a no. And you got to start removing whole sections of this bill, to the point. I mean, I heard the sponsor of the bill, and he started listing off the committee substitute what was not in the bill, and I feel like he listed off everything that was in the bill as not being in the bill. And so I was struggling a bit with what's still there. The House has taken a little bit of a different approach in trying to pass some piecemeal items on liability, on tax incentives, on property appraisals as it relates to this type of emissions control. And so Those are moving to the Senate. I think at the end of the day, there'll be a few things there that the state will be able to point to and say, we're continuing to try to be a competitive place to attract this level of investment. I think our greatest gift, though, is large tracts of land. That being either the general land office and the waters that we control off the coast, or very large landowners in South Texas, like the King Ranch, that have been able to come to the table with operators, come to the table with industrial customers that are trying to dispose of this CO2, and put some pretty good projects together, that if they can get some regulatory certainty from EPA, or if EPA will delegate that to the Railroad Commission,
Right.
these projects will be able to get up and go in a few short years. But if we are needing to create big, large units of CO2 storage that have many different surface owners, and lots of different potential legal liabilities, I think the legislature has basically said we're not interested in intervening in that complexity just yet.
Yeah.
Maybe that's down the road, but for now, at least the projects that are available today are going to be very large tract landowners, and proximity or closeness to industrial CO2 that needs to be disposed of.
And that's the best model for a CCUS project. Anyway, you need to have that proximity to the emitters and the infrastructure to move the CO2, or at least have it economic to build the infrastructure if it doesn't exist. And, that's why there's been such a focus on areas like the Houston Ship Channel and the Golden Triangle and Corpus Christi and offshore underground storage space that's controlled by the Texas General Land Office. That's been the big focus so far. These onshore projects, I think you're right, or without some clarifying legislation, it's just going to have to be the big tract owners doing business, in those, that have close proximity to the emitters.
Yep.
And so it'll be somewhat limited. But for the future, you're going to have to clarify that to really expand it onshore. So anyway, it's not something that's do or die for the industry as a whole, and at least we've got that going for us.
That's right.
So we've talked in the past also about the bill that would have put in place a new incentive that would have incentivized second frac jobs, going in, re-entering horizontal shale wells and doing a second frac job on them. Has there been any project on that bill over the past week?
No, unfortunately, that fiscal note has really stymied us.
Got a big bad fiscal
pretty
note,
considerably. I can happily report, though, it did pass in North Dakota, and so the Bakken, I think, will get some reinvestment over the next year, and really start to get this to be proven out. There's quite a bit of R&D that will need to take place as part of this, to make sure that those service companies can re-enter those wells, run that lateral pretty considerably, get that perforation gun back down into those holes, and re-stimulate them. So there's not something off the shelf right now that can easily plug and play in. That's part of the reason that an incentive needs to be put in place by the state to attract that type of investment and prove it up. But unfortunately, we got a fiscal analysis that makes an assumption that this is going to happen organically over the next 2 years, and that the state would be at a loss for severance tax dollars, because this activity is going to happen naturally. And so,
Right.
on one hand, I'm excited if that proves out to be correct. I'd love to be wrong on this deal and see that level of investment in the state, particularly the amount of the production that the fiscal analysis projects. Pretty solid increase in production. We had an independent analysis that came back into several of the trades that are working on this bill, and they had a conservative half a million barrels produced by restimulating just a small fraction of wells, because of the benefit
Right.
to adjacent wells and child wells that really would benefit from the same strata being re-fracked. So it's unfortunate. I think we've got one more kind of not even an ace. We're pretty low card that we're playing here, inside straight draw or something. But we're hoping that we can have some life on Monday. That's kind of our last chance out of House Ways and Means. I think we'll have some potentially some positive press, maybe some support from some of the railroad commissioners. But that being said, as we opened up with, the clock is ticking, and that 30-day time horizon, and more closely that May 10th deadline to get off the House floor, is really is coming quickly.
Oh, well, gosh. Well, let's keep our fingers crossed for Monday. We're closing in on 30 minutes here already. Golly, time flies. What does next week look like? Any preview you have for us for next week of important
So
things coming up?
I think we talked last week about Grow and Strong being in House
Oh, right.
Appropriations. They will be on the House floor on Monday. They seem kind of wed together right now by the chamber, and hopefully that's the case where they'll both get a hearing in Senate Finance if they can make it over there. Of course, Grow takes severance taxes generated by those counties and allows for those counties to apply to the state for a grant
These are
to
counties
shore
with
up.
high oil and gas activity in them, right?
With Grow is any amount of production, so any amount of
Okay.
oil and natural gas production, they can apply for a grant to shore up roads, hospitals, education infrastructure, those sorts of things. Strong is a little bit different. It looks at the top 10 to 15% of counties, and says that those counties can apply to the state for a grant for very similar purposes. It also has some diversion, if you will, taking severance tax dollars, putting them back into the Railroad Commission, putting them back into Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So that has some appeal from appropriators as well. And so we'll see. I have every confidence the House will continue the practice and move both bills forward. And then we'll see what the Senate wants to do, how they want to decide on this. It would certainly be a great benefit to local communities if they could retain some amount of the severance tax dollars generated in those communities. There's no question they benefit from the property tax rolls and the added production in that area, the sales tax expended in those areas. But a portion of the severance tax dollars back to those communities would certainly be a nice shot in the arm.
Sure would. Sure would. And that's always an issue that comes up anytime you have a big oil and gas play in any location. Is all the heavy truck traffic does impact the roads and other infrastructure. And so, yeah, I mean, those seem like two really well-purposed bills. So hopefully they'll continue to advance through the process. With that, unless you have anything else you want to add, we can call this one good and go on about our weekends.
That's perfect.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll talk to you again next week.